it.
That's what I'm talking about.
Wait.
Okay, now, from the beginning.
Welcome to BS, Beyond Stereotypes, a podcast about lawyers using their authentic voices to change the world.
You know, a great litigator I listened to once said, I write my closing statement prior to the case. You know, the case walks in the door, and the very first thing I do is I write the closing statement. And that's true for life. You know, I don't want to leave the earth without having helped move the needle in some important areas. And so I think getting really clear as early as you can, it's hard to do this. I mean, you know, as you become an adult, your ideas change. But it's always good to be thinking about what is your closing statement, or what's somebody else's closing statement going to be about you. And if you're like me, at least you want to, that closing statement starts with he or she help move the needle.
Welcome to BS, Beyond Stereotypes. I'm your host, Merle Vaughn. Here to BS with me today is my friend, Mark Zemelman, whose story I find fascinating and who will no doubt inspire all of you to embrace your authenticity. Hey, Mark, how are you?
Very good. And enjoying retirement. How are you doing?
Good. Okay, don't give away too much. We're gonna we'll get there. No, I'm great. And I'm very happy for you. So, let me tell the listeners a little bit about you, Mark, and then we'll get started. And I don't go into long bios because they can Google you. But Mark Zemelman, until recently, was a senior vice president in GC for Kaiser Foundation Health Plan, the nation's largest nonprofit managed care organization. Mark attended UC Santa Cruz, where he received a degree in history. He received his JD from UC Hastings, magna cum laude, I might add. And after attending law school, worked for a couple of big law firms, McCutcheon Doyle, and then Orrick. He joined Kaiser, I think it was in 1991, and was there for over 30 years before entering the lovely world of retirement this year. Did I miss anything,
That was
Mark?
perfect. That was perfect. You forgot to mention that I'm part of the Merle Vaughn fan club, and make a point of mentioning your name at all the conferences I speak at.
I know. I love that. I don't know. I need to start finding conferences for you in case you decide you don't want to do it anymore, because I like it when you do that.
Oh, I'm still doing conferences. I did a conference on Sunday with a whole bunch of GCs, and I mentioned your name again.
Oh my goodness, I love it. Thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate you. And we'll get into why you do that a little bit later in the podcast. But first, I'd like to start out by asking the folks with whom I speak about their upbringing. Like, I want to, kind of give us a idea of your story, like your beginnings, to the extent that you're comfortable, your upbringing, your parents, and kind of what how that affected your journey throughout your career.
Okay. So the things that I think are relevant are, number one, my father was one of the very early physicians at Kaiser Permanente. He joined Southern California Permanente Medical Group, started up in 1953 as a formal group. And he joined that year and was one of the, they had just opened up the Sunset Hospital, which was the flagship hospital for Kaiser Permanente in Los Angeles, the downtown hospital. And he was one of the first doctors there. Eventually, when they opened up the Panorama City Hospital, over in the Valley. We then moved over there, and he was one of the founding doctors for that hospital. Um, so I was raised in Kaiser Permanente. It was a radical organization at that time in the sense of that the AMA believed that it was a socialist institution and was out to kill it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. As a doctor at Kaiser Permanente, you were essentially destroying your career if you ever planned to go back into private practice because the regular medical industry would not deal with you. Um, he was not allowed to become a member of the county medical association, which doctors always want to be part of. He was not allowed to be a member of the California Medical Association or the AMA because they believed, again, Kaiser was a socialist organization, and they, which it wasn't. But the idea of doctors on salary, just and group practice, where everyone's responsible for the patients, it was just appalling to them, even though that actually is the same model you see in universities.
Right.
So, it truly was not radical. But, the AMA really was scared of the economics. They were worried that physicians would lose the ability to charge whatever they wanted to, which is true. And so they really went after they really tried to destroy Kaiser. And it wasn't until 1959 where a report came out sponsored by the AMA that showed that, in fact, the Kaiser and these similar organizations were actually providing as good or better care than the rest of the healthcare system. And they finally had to concede that these were actually just fine institutions, and they finally started letting physicians in from Kaiser. My father finally got an invitation to join the County Medical Association, I think in the early 60s, and he declined it. He was so pissed off. So, I grew up with the founders, and I grew up understanding the original mission, which was all about affordability. The idea, it was a very, very fine group of physicians because, again, only the, the most courageous were going to join the organization. And they were, quite intent on building what was both going to be the highest quality system as well as the most affordable. And
So you grew up with a father who's a doctor. He was at Kaiser. You went to college and to study chemistry. Was that because you wanted to be a doc? You thought you wanted to be a doctor?
yeah, originally I did, and then I took William Hitchcock's history course, and that changed what I was interested in. Um, the other point that mention about my background is that I always, it's really funny. I've been doing diversity work forever. I was interested in it long before I got into law, and I always get, I get a certain degree of skepticism because, I'm a traditional looking white male, and people always wonder if it's sincere. And the point that I make to people is I was born only 9 years after the war ended, World War II.
Mhm.
Most of my family was wiped out. They were shot, gassed, they were killed. And uh, when as I was growing up in a traumatized family. My grandparents had lost their brothers, sisters. My grandmother lost her mother. And the trauma was still very, very real. And so I grew up quite clear on the fact that I was part of a minority group that some wanted to exterminate.
Yeah.
Um, and as a consequence, it was very natural for Jews at that time to be deeply involved in civil rights. It's true today, but it was really true then. So when you take a look at one of my favorite photographs is the group of lawyers who brought Brown versus Board of Education. It's a group of black men with Thurgood Marshall in the middle, with one tall white guy standing behind the
Yeah.
table, and his name is Greenberg.
Yeah.
He eventually became the head of the NAACP litigation division after Thurgood got on the court. And that connection was very, very deep. So, that to me was just very natural. And I've, spent my life feeling that, it's part of my obligation as, coming out of that background, to fight for groups that have been, historically discriminated against. And obviously African Americans being the most within the United States. So I also wanted to give that background.
Why and I'm glad you talked about that, because I think that people do, they're people too readily chastise straight white men, right? and generalizations are not good, and that is a stereotype. That's what this podcast is about. This podcast is about, stereotypes. Everybody is subjected to them, and the people who are aware of them and able to overcome them is what I like to talk about, and just bring it to the forefront to folks that everybody is subjected. So you just talked about that, the fact that nobody would expect you to be as zealous about diversity and equity and inclusion as you are, just by looking at you, because they don't know that background story.
Right.
So you went to law school, you worked at some big firms, you were a environmental litigator, I believe. Right.
I actually came out of school. I was interested in two things. One was civil rights, and the other was environmental. And I first went to work for a big for Orrick Carrington, and I worked there for 2 years and realized I was making so much money that I would never be able to go into a civil rights practice if I kept going this direction. So I literally quit one day. Now,
Wow.
I did have a job set up. I had already talked to Sandy Rosen, who ran the only remaining private civil rights firm in San Francisco. And he was going to pay me the magnificent rate of $27,000 a year. So I took a big cut to go over there. But I felt like I really had to do that practice and see if it worked. And so I quit Orrick on very good terms. They were all a little surprised that I left, and I went over to Sandy's office and had a blast. I was in federal court constantly, working on big civil rights cases.
I didn't know that, Mark. How did I
Yeah,
know that?
yeah, and just had a great time. Got much more litigation experience over there because, of course, in a small office like that, I, as a young associate, got thrown right into federal court dealing with, one of the judges who was known for eating lawyers, uh, and just had a great time. But the problem is that the Supreme Court at that stage was shutting down the fee petitions, and a firm like that survived on fee petitions. And so it became very clear that Sandy was not going to be able to maintain a pure civil rights practice. It would have to become much more of a standard business firm with a civil rights practice on the side, and I didn't want to do that. So I eventually, after a year of litigation, I called up one of the partners from Orrick, had moved over to McCutcheon and in the environmental area, and asked if they could take me in. And they said they didn't have any jobs, but he went and talked to the rest of the team, and they decided to bring me in. So I ended up at McCutcheon under David Andrews, the first African American managing partner of a major firm in the United States. And
Nice.
I ended up working for him, which was, again, just great fun. David being just a wonderful, wonderful human being, and unfortunately died way too young. And I was at McCutcheon until they asked me to become a part. They told me the partnership would be conditioned on me moving to San Jose and starting the practice there with a group of lawyers. And my wife at the time was a partner in a small firm up in San Francisco and said she'd divorce me if I did that. So I called up my favorite client, Kaiser, and said it'll be a lot cheaper for you to hire me if than to keep paying me as an outside lawyer. And the economics made sense to them, and in literally 1 week, I was at Kaiser.
Wow. This is a great story for folks to who don't realize, how you can be instrumental in, your own career, right? Like just pick up the phone and call people. I tell people that all the time, because, when they really want to do something, it's like, look, I can help you as a recruiter and I will try to help you as a recruiter, but you have to participate in this also. And I think that was a great example
Well,
of,
the truth, Merle, is that I never got a job in law that I applied to, with the exception of the general counsel job. Every other job didn't exist. Every other job was created for me. It was a matter of, I got the job at Oric in a really bad job market. And so I just decided I'll go out and do informational interviewing. And so, I called up a whole bunch of Hastings grads at various law firms. And I was at Oric, and we just had a great conversation. And after the conversation was done, they decided they'd create a position for me. And Sandy Rosen just created a position for me because I called them up and said, I want to do civil rights. I'm willing to take a big haircut financially to do it. And so all those jobs that I had leading up to the general counsel job were, there was no job. It was just a matter of creating it through conversation.
wow. Do you think that happens today? How often do you think?
Yes, absolutely. No question about that.
Interesting. That's, I'm really glad to hear that. If I ever decide to do anything else, I'll just try to get somebody to create something for me. I love it. So, okay, so you go to Kaiser, you have this interesting connection to Kaiser because your dad was one of the first doctors. You grew up, as a Kaiser kid for the most part, Kaiser family. Everybody knows that you are probably the last true historian for Kaiser, which is really cool. And so you've kind of you kind of go full circle, but at that time, you ended up kind of being a legal generalist, right? In-house as a legal generalist, but then you become you decide that there should be specialists. Is that something that you decided? Because it seems to be what
Yeah,
has happened in legal departments. And do you think that was, is that still, is that a good thing, or is it necessary, or, what's the
it's
effect?
necessary. In a large legal department, you really have to design it on a large law firm model, meaning that it's full of specialists. Otherwise, you're just not getting the efficiencies. Healthcare has become highly specialized, just like medicine has, and uh, generalists just simply can't be as efficient. So they end up having to, if they're in house, they then have to. If you have a department that's so small that it has to be all generalists, then you're going to do a lot of outside counsel hiring and specialists at God knows what they're charging nowadays, $800, $900 an hour. It's just too expensive. So if you've got the size on the inside to bring in the specialists, that's what you really have to do. And what struck me when I joined Kaiser was that the department was, there were 70 lawyers or 75 lawyers throughout the organization when I joined, but they didn't all report to the general counsel. Only 20 of them, I think, reported to the general counsel. The rest were located in the regions.
Mhm.
Kaiser was a sort of a loose association of regional health plans back in those days, or regional health systems, I should say. And and so each of those departments were so small that they all had to be generalists, and they all reported up to their respective regional counsel and regional presidents rather than up to the general counsel. And so I went to the general counsel and I said, this doesn't make any sense. You've got, I gave you the example of real estate. You've got 8 different regions doing real estate deals. The lawyers handling those have no background in real estate.
Right.
There's only one guy who's got a background, but he's only serving Southern California. So what I ended up suggesting was, why don't you nationalize this department, make it a single department nationally, then you can switch over to experts, and then you'll have one real estate guy whose background is all in real estate, and he can serve the entire country, do the deals, for the entire system. And so we took that to the CEO, and he liked the idea, and he put together a charter that, frankly, I wrote, that because politically that was very hard. Everybody likes to have their team of lawyers. So
Right.
we were not going to get that done ourselves. It had to be the CEO basically directing the regional presidents that we're going to nationalize the legal department and you're going to lose your little team. And so he wrote a charter, or I wrote the charter, he issued it, and we converted to a national department. That was a point in history where Kaiser was moving from, as it had to, moving from, again, a fairly, really an entirely decentralized system where each region was very much autonomous, moving to become a national company. And this was something happening in healthcare. Healthcare was very late to the concept of shared service type organizations, national systems, that everything that can be made more efficient through centralization would be centralized. That was something that healthcare came to very late. And we were the first department to lead the way on that within Kaiser, and then many departments came after us, and now the company is pretty much a full shared service operation.
Got it. Okay, so you have specialists in the legal department, but almost everybody not everybody, but most people who join in-house, go in-house, ultimately think that they want to be a GC. They want to be the general counsel, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to be a general counsel, do you need to be a generalist? And if you do need to be a generalist, how does that, this now specialty model affect people being ready, GC
Yeah,
ready?
it's a serious problem. I started off in environmental law, and environmental law was very new when I joined, and those of us in that field did everything. We did the litigation, we did the business deals. I actually wrote a lot of regulations because at that time there was, the regulations in the environmental area were very new. And so actually the city of San Francisco came to McCutcheon and said, could you help us out on a volunteer basis to write our hazardous waste regulations? And I'm the one who did it. So, we were doing everything. And that was a wonderful background for eventually becoming a GC. But in the modern world of specialization, that was unique. That just doesn't happen anymore. And so it became a real problem for succession planning. I had to
Right.
figure out a way to take these specialists I had hired and give them, the full background. And so what I did, because I knew I was going to retire eventually, and so I began succession planning pretty early. And what I ended up doing was moving lawyers around intentionally to different areas of practice. And so I took, for instance, the person who headed up, the assistant general counsel who headed up the regulatory practice. I had her take over the business practice for a period of a couple of years so that she would learn that part. And very awkward, but it worked. Everybody understood what I was doing, and the lawyers in the business section were really cooperative in helping train her. And you just had to do things that were quite artificial like that in order to prepare successors.
Well, and I think that that's important because, as you go up and higher in a organization, there become fewer and fewer opportunities, right? So there's only, there may be, 10 VP positions, but there's only one GC position, right? And
Right.
so there's no guarantee that anybody that you've prepared is going to actually get that position. But at least that person will have been prepared should they decide that, there's an opportunity somewhere else, right?
Yeah, and it just means that succession planning has to be highly intentional. You've got to start your succession planning uh, years ahead of time. 6, 7 years ahead of time, and you have to pick a few people who you think could do the job well, and then you very consciously need to develop the skill set. And again, that takes some degree of artificialness, moving people into places where they just don't have the background. I think that's really the best way to prepare successors nowadays.
So let's talk about outside counsel. You alluded to the fact that the fees, you said $800-900. Actually, depending on the firm, it could be 1,000, 1,500, and depending on the matter. But what role, what's the role of outside counsel in uh, in organizations like Kaiser? What role do the fees play? And then we'll talk about diversity.
Okay. Well, if you go to a meeting of general counsel, inevitably there'll be a discussion about how outrageous and impossible the outside counsel rack rates are nowadays. Um, and everyone is working on trying to figure out how to get the cost of outside counsel down. I mean, the fact is, you still got to use outside counsel, usually for litigation, but also, there are some highly specialized areas where you can't afford to have them in house, and so you have to go to the outside. And also big deals. You're just not staffed up to do a merger and acquisition usually.
Right.
So but the costs are prohibitive, and the healthcare field is a particularly challenging one because healthcare is too expensive. The government is now the major payer in the United States. The federal government pays for most. If you take the total cost of healthcare, the federal government's paying for most of it. And the difficulty is that the federal government can't afford, just literally cannot afford, to continue having healthcare rates escalate at 5-6% a year. And so CMS, it handles Medicare and Medicaid, has made it clear that it's going to keep the rate of the amount it's willing to pay per capita, per person, is going to be lower than the rate of inflation, the rate of medical inflation. And that's going to be true for the next 10 or 20, who knows how long, years. And so we are in a declining per capita market, and we are going to be for a very, very long time. And that means that our partners, the people who supply all of the goods and services and the rest, are going to have to come into that market as well. They're going to have to come into that pricing structure as well if they're going to be our partners. And this is hard. The law firms all want their 5 to 10% increases each year. And, the GCs are all really clear on the fact that you want to partner with us, you got to live in the world we live in. So you got to figure out how to share, the increase we get. And that's not going to be 5-6%.
But hasn't that happened before in other practice areas? For example, the one I remember, at least in my legal career, it happened to first was kind of the public arena of bonds, and that there used to be big firms that did public bonds and stuff like that, public finance,
Right.
and then they decided they just got out of it, and then even with labor and employment, a lot of big firms just got out of labor employment. Do you see that potentially happening for healthcare?
It's possible. Employment was easy to split off because it could be taken up by smaller firms with just one partner. You bring in somebody who really knows employment law backwards and forwards and can litigate, and suddenly you've got an employment law practice. The problem with healthcare is that it takes a cluster of lawyers. You got to have somebody who understands Medicaid and Medicare, and you've got to have people who get the state regulations, and the corporate side is incredibly complicated because of all the licensing issues. And so it takes, I don't know what the number is, but it takes probably a group of 4 or 5 people. And that's very hard for the small firms to do. That's a big investment. So we haven't seen that happen in healthcare the way you might expect from the economics. I hope it does. I would like to. That was something that when I was GC, I was trying to foster. I was talking to various small firms about, let's figure out a way where we can help finance you over a period of years. In exchange, we get lower rates, and here's the kind of people you need to bring in.
Right.
But I never was able to swing it. So yes, I mean, employment law just became small firm practice, and that's the way it should be. I don't understand the big firm model anymore. The big firms are so wedded to their high profit per partner model and their heavy staffing model that they're willing to turn away whole areas of business in order to keep that model. And
Right.
it strikes me as very odd. Most companies in the United States do not turn away gigantic books of business. You see it in the malpractice area where, the malpractice area of business is all small firms. I mean, literally
Right.
100%. But it's worth a fortune. I mean, malpractice is a big business in the United States, and one that the healthcare industry hates.
Right.
And it's estimated at around 2% of healthcare costs. And I'm not sure about that estimate, by the way. It's just a number I've heard. But it's a gigantic number, and the big firms have simply decided, well, it doesn't fit our model, so we won't do it. Who turns away hundreds of millions of dollars of business? They ought to be setting up. The big firms should set up subsidiaries that run on a lower cost model and can do that work. But I don't get it. If I ever decide to, go back part time to a firm, that'll be one of the very first questions I ask, which is why aren't we why aren't we setting up subsidiaries and jumping in just the way that, say, the big airlines have set up these lower cost subs to compete with Southwest?
Well, it could be. It could have some. I've been thinking a lot about like lately, and it could have a lot to do with ego. This idea that it's not it because there's so much of it that it's not as sophisticated, or it's volume, and it could be that big firms are competing for the kind of this ego driven work, to show that they're the most sophisticated, or
Yeah, yeah. Well, I do think I do think you're right. I mean, law firms are run usually by lawyers who are not trained business people. And
right.
so they're operating on the basis of their own feelings rather than business principles. And so, yeah, ego and other emotional things get into it, no question about that. Still, we are starting to see big law firms hire real business people, folks
Mhm.
who are
Yes.
not JDs, and to help run them from a financial perspective. And so I still remain a bit surprised that they're not jumping in, because there's a lot of business there that they've literally just given up. I once made an offer to I had been thinking this way for a very long time. And so for a while, I was hunting down East Coast firms that had healthcare practices that had not opened up on the West Coast. And I went to a few of them and made them offers where I said, look, you set up a West Coast office in Oakland, and back in those days at $2 to $3 a square foot, instead of what was $20 a square foot off in San Francisco, and you bring over healthcare partners to that practice who will work with me at rates that are 30 to 40% below your normal rates. And what I will do is guarantee you the business. So those partners are not going to need to hunt for business. I will
Right.
guarantee the business, and I will guarantee it for a period of years. So instead of your partners going out and hunting for business 30% of their time, they're just going to be billing. But in return, I get the low rates and the expertise, and you folks get an office on the West Coast that has a guaranteed line of business. I couldn't believe they all turned it down. And I know that one of the firms actually had a firm wide partner meeting to discuss doing this.
Mhm.
And they ended up deciding not to do it for the reason that their partners couldn't figure out how they would allocate the dollars at the end of the year, because you would have these partners in the firm that were earning money on a different basis, and you couldn't score them by the same algorithm.
Well, so that is a pretty good segue to talking about diversity, and the reason I say that is because you've always, as long as I've known you, which has been thankfully a long time, since about 2008 or so, you've always thought outside of the box. You've always been, and I think that's why we get along so well, is because we are both always thinking, how can something be different and what can we do differently. And so, but I think that that's hard for lawyers. I think that most lawyers, we're both lawyers, but it's hard for most lawyers to think like that, think about doing something novel or differently, and standing up for it. But you've done that, particularly with respect to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, in Kaiser, and you've talked about this to other GCs. You know, why do you think you're able to do that and do it successfully?
Well, I've got the trend of the future on my side. The demographics in the country are, are immutable. They are. We are going. I think California already is majority minority, right?
Right.
And the rest of the country is moving that way. So, this is inevitable. Consumer companies that sell to consumers are selling to a diverse consumer group, and in fact, majority soon diverse consumer group. And so, in order to be able to succeed, they're going to have to be diverse internally. People like to see people who look like themselves. And so, if you're going to be successful as a consumer business, you got to look like your consumers, which means that your workforce is going to be that way. And the workforce is not going to be that way unless they can look up the chain and see that the executives are that way. And so, in the long run, you know, time is on our side, right? I think of us not as we're going to win. It's just a matter of maybe we're pushing to win a little bit earlier. Um, so I think that from a business perspective, the case is just absolutely compelling, and it's proven out by various studies that show that diverse companies tend to do better in the United States. And there's sort of an obvious logic to that. But there's also obviously a moral logic to it, which we talked about earlier, where that comes from. And I have come to believe that you get ultimately better lawyers, you get a better legal department when it's diverse and inclusive. It can't be just diverse. You actually have to have the inclusiveness, meaning that
Right.
you have to have the hard discussions. And I read an article in the Harvard Business Review. So I think it was a 2017 article on why diversity in legal departments, but also in any company, when accompanied with inclusion, creates a better business. And the reason is because of the discomfort. It's actually, diversity makes people uncomfortable. They're
Yep.
dealing with people who don't look like themselves. And if you're willing to bring that to the front, in other words, you're willing to talk about it, then what happens is you get a group of people who have to face their own unconscious bias. And that means they're having to look at themselves and become, if you will, more conscious people. And it also means that you take a group of people who don't talk about the obvious, the elephant on the table, which in America is race, and they're suddenly talking about it if you structure those conversations and make sure they happen. This is the job of leadership, to make sure those
Right.
conversations happen in a structured way. And when you do that, you suddenly get a group of people, and this is particularly important for lawyers, who can rationally, calmly talk about the most difficult issue in the country. Well, when you can do that, if you can get a group of lawyers who can talk about race, you got a group of lawyers who can talk about anything.
Right. Right.
Right? And what do you look for in lawyers? You look for, and what do you want out of a legal department? You want a group of people who can rationally, calmly talk to anyone about the most difficult subjects. Well, what better training ground than to internally become diverse and then really look at what feelings that raises, and what does that mean in terms of our unconscious beliefs and how we need to surface them and, if you will, mold them, change them. And so I think, frankly, you just get a better group of lawyers as lawyers, and frankly,
Right.
as people. I really love what we did with our department. We had tons of conversations, really difficult ones. The kind of conversations where, before they happened, I had people come in my office and say, Mark, you're going to get us sued. You're getting into areas that are really sensitive. And my feeling was, all right. I don't think we'll get sued. I think we're going to do this the right way. And in any case, it's worth taking the risk. And so we did. And, frankly, I wasn't the one who led the conversations usually. They were usually led by really wonderful, wonderful lawyers in my team, like Tamra. And the conversations happened. There were no lawsuits. And I really feel people grew and became better human beings as well as better lawyers.
And I applaud you for that. And I was fortunate to kind of be, play some role in that over the years. And we had a lot of fun.
Well,
Uh,
you played a huge role. I mean, the concept of having people don't know the background, so it's worth, I think, spending a minute on that. I worked with a lot of healthcare recruiters prior to meeting you, and they were all white, and they kept telling me there's they go out do a search and they come back with all white candidates, and they tell me there are no minority candidates, and I know that's not true, so I just kept forcing them to go back, and I just couldn't get any cooperation. So I finally decided, all right, I'm going to go find a minority recruiter, and it may be not. I couldn't find anybody who specialized in healthcare, but I figured I'd train them. So I went out and found 3 minority-owned companies, headhunter companies for lawyers. You were one of them, and I tested all 3 of them. You were the best, and so we literally steered all our business to you. And I got a lot of resistance for steering everything your way, particularly because you weren't in the healthcare field at the time. But I ran the practice, so I won, and we ended up with you becoming a real expert in our field, and ultimately we ran all searches through you, even the in-house searches. The searches where we believed we'd end up with an in-house person, because to do true diversity hiring, you got to look all around because you don't know what you're missing.
right.
So, and the upshot of it was that you really were responsible for diversifying our department and making it what it is today. So you get a gigantic amount of credit for where we ended up.
Well, thank you. I wasn't angling for that, but I appreciate it. But I guess what I wanted to talk about is a little bit, let's get out of our business a little bit and kind of compare that to what's happening in the world right now. And you make good points. The California's majority minority, the country is going that direction. And I think that I wonder if that's stoking so much fear, because we do really seem to be going backwards, at least in my view. We're going backwards, and folks are trying to take away all these rights and turn back the clock and undo everything that's been done. And you know, the fact that you say that it make diversity makes companies better and people better, but people are it seems to be so hard fought right now. I mean, do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, which, being an oldest, student of history, um, you always get resistance to any kind of progressive change, and in particular, where people have what I believe is an irrational fear of losing their enhanced place in society, their privilege, if you will. Um, they fight, and but that's happened throughout American history and probably throughout world history. Um, and it's I think that one both has to have a certain degree of compassion for the people who feel like they're losing something, but
Mm,
also at the same time, um, you know, history does go in one direction. I view history as over thousands of years of civilization as being a process of where the weak become the leadership. Um,
interesting.
and it goes up and down, in the short term, there's wins and losses, but over the course of history as a whole, you know, it, there's no question that, a if you look at a few thousand years ago at the Roman Empire or any of the great empires of the time, male dominated in particular by the males who are the most physical and capable at war. You got to remember that the early kings of England were not trained in letters; they were trained in warfare,
Huh.
and they depended on uh, the people who worked for them to be the ones who did the writing and thinking and policy making and the rest of it. They were expected to be warriors, and women now. Um, women have the vote. They've got a huge impact in politics and business, and uh, leadership nowadays has to be. The expectation is to be very, very well educated. I think everyone recognizes that the nerds have taken over the business world. Because a famous quote attributed to, even if it didn't really come from him, to Bill Gates on that point. And it is I do think that history does have a direction, um, and it gives me confidence that if again we approach it from the standpoint of we are going to win this. The world is going to become more diverse, inclusive, and educated, and forward thinking. Um, and it's a matter of getting there in the right way, getting there hopefully as peacefully as possible. I think that that's kind of the attitude that I try to approach these things with.
Interesting. So there's setback. There's always going to be setbacks, but it's always going to go forward.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's talk about something a little bit more fun. I know that you are a huge classical music fan. And can you tell me where that comes from and like what's your favorite, and talk to me about classical music, Mark.
Oh, I don't know as much about it as I'd like to. Never have had the time to really study it. But my father was truly a classical music buff and had a massive record collection that I now have. And so I was raised, it was always in the background as I was being
Hmm.
raised. And I didn't appreciate it till high school. But in high school, I began listening to Beethoven and just fell in love with the complexity of the work. And as I get older, um, it's really quite amazing to listen, for instance, to Beethoven's the Opus 130 series of quartets, because he was very old when he produced those, and I don't think you can understand them when you're young.
Interesting.
They're, they involve a set of complex emotions that you have to have lived life with all of its great pains and struggles and the rest of it to really understand. And I found them when I was young to be very dissonant and very hard to get into. And now I listen to them, and I can listen to them again and again and again because I'm just so struck by how meaningful all of the different emotions that are conveyed by that music contain. Um, so, classical music contains, it's not like popular music, which I love also, by the way. I really do love popular music too. But popular music's always based around one theme. There's every song has one theme that it
Uh-huh.
conveys. Classical music is deeply complicated in the sense of that it covers a whole range of emotions, and you can sit through a symphony. And nowadays, I'm more into the quartets. And you just go through an entire life of emotions through a complex piece. I don't know if that is, I don't know if that makes any sense to somebody who doesn't listen to classical music, right? I don't know if you do or not. Are you into
Well, yeah,
classical music?
I love classical music. I love all music. My father was a jazz musician, and
Oh, I didn't know that.
yeah, so he played the bass both upright. I restored his upright basses in my living room, but he played the bass, the Fender. I have his Fender.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
How old is that Fender?
it's older than me, Mark. It's older than me.
Whoa, what a
Um,
classic.
yeah, and so I really have an affinity for what I call the bottom, the bass line
Yeah.
in just
Uh-huh.
about everything. I'm not really musical in that I don't play any instruments. It skipped generations. My daughter is a phenomenal musician and has perfect pitch and sings and all that. But I did grow up with a lot of music. He had a Hammond organ, which I can't believe I sold.
Wow.
I should
Wow.
not have sold it, but I didn't have any place to put it. But he was born in 1921. He in Oklahoma. He was self-taught. He sent away from music, taught himself how to read music. Um, and was I have his saxophone, I have his clarinet. And those are some great stories of he went to Tuskegee, learned how to fly planes, and the Air Force wouldn't take him into the Air Force because they said N-words don't fly. And so he ended up in the Navy and in the Navy band. So I probably am only here because he got to make music and avoided combat because he was a really good musician. But so I say all that to say that I do, and my daughter was classically trained. I have her grand piano in my living room that I don't know how to play. And So I do appreciate all music, and I do understand what you're saying about music, and I find a lot of solace in music and dance. I was classically trained in ballet.
Wow.
Yes,
That's fantastic.
yeah,
Jazz is very much the same. You go off into, take one of Miles's long half, taking up half of the LP jazz pieces, and it's the same thing of taking you through a lifetime of emotions and remarkably deep.
yeah. So speaking of thinking outside of the box and differently, and we're coming to the end of our time here, which is makes me very sad. But when we were working together, you started a practice of taking candidates for a walk around the lake. And I'll never forget when I went up to meet you the first time in person. You said, do you have another pair of shoes? And I was like, well, actually, I do because I, traveled up here. And you said, put them on. We're gonna have this meeting walking around the lake. Which I was like, oh God, what is this gonna do? It was wonderful. It was therapeutic. But how did you start that? Why? And talk to me about your walks.
Yeah, I really believe that people should learn this. It's a far better way to have one on one meetings. Every meeting where you sit across a table just the process of sitting across the table has a formality to it that creates a barrier. And the second thing is that when you're sitting in chairs, meetings halfway through, everybody the blood sugar drops and everybody starts to fall asleep.
Right.
Somewhere towards the last 10 minutes, we realize that we got to get this agenda done, and so you wake up again and you try to get through the rest of the meeting. And when you walk around the lake, you don't have the drop in blood sugar because you're walking, so everything keeps flowing. And the second thing is that you're walking side by side and you
Yeah.
got the environment around you. And so it breaks down the barriers. And so I don't know when I clued into this, but a very long time ago, probably when I got into management back at the end of the 90s, I just began doing one-on-one conversations, doing them as a walk around the lake. And then I realized that interviews go so much better because you get rid of that formality and you start to really learn about who the person is. And people just get more relaxed and they start loosening up and telling you more about themselves. So I made a policy of doing a sit down interview for, half hour, 45 minutes with each candidate to get the formalities out of the way and then go take a walk around the lake afterwards. And, both it's good. Every candidate's ready for a 1 hour discussion where they're going to, stick with their pre-planned agenda. But, that second hour they're not ready for, and particularly walking. And so you really do learn more about the person. So I just built that into my practice. My difficulty was that as I got older, my stamina started to go down a little bit. And I found that, a lot of these young candidates coming in, being in their 30s, a lot of them were runners and things. And so we'd go launch around the lake and suddenly they're walking, at 4 miles an hour. And damned if I'm going to ever say to somebody I'm walking with, slow down. So,
Right.
I'd be dying by the end of some of these walks.
That is hilarious.
Yeah, but that strategy for for interviewing only works till a certain age.
Well, I do think that, and again, this podcast is about not only stereotypes, but authenticity. And there are so many things about you that are just so authentic. And one of the things that have already always appreciated about you is that you remain authentic. You come up with ideas, you do things differently. You stick to your guns and authentic. I mean, how have you managed to do that? And do you suggest, how do you suggest that that younger people, slow down, y'all, but how do you suggest that they do that in their careers?
Well, I'm very goal oriented. I mean, I'm very clear on the fact that you have a limited amount of time on Earth, and and it's important to, a great litigator I listened to once said, I write my closing statement prior to the case. The case walks in the door, and the very first thing I do is I write the closing statement.
Interesting.
And that's true for life. I don't want to leave the earth without having helped move the needle in some important areas. And so I think getting really clear as early as you can. It's hard to do this. I mean, as you become an adult, your ideas change. But it's always good to be thinking about what is your closing statement, or what's somebody else's closing statement going to be about you. And if you're like me, at least you want that closing statement starts with he or she help move the needle. And so knowing where you want to help move the needle is really crucial, and then staying very, very focused on those goals. Lawyers are very process oriented. That's our job, is to make sure that whatever the clients are trying to do, that it's done the right way. I think it's very important that we realize that as very bright, well-educated people who tend to be fairly knowledgeable around politics and economics and, just generally they read a lot, that we also should also be clear on what our values are and
Yeah.
what we want to accomplish in terms of society, uh, and always keep those things in mind. Um, and so I just think it's goal oriented. Diversity is a really good point here. So many people say, lawyers, particularly managing partners in law firms, say, geez, it's just so difficult. I just have so much trouble, finding the right people and then keeping them in the firm, and, on and on and on. And how do you do all that? My point is really simple, which is, look, if you're serious about making the change, just set the end goal.
Yeah.
If your end goal is to have your partnership within 5 years be 20% minority and 40% women, do it.
Right. Just do it.
Do it. And you do it. If you're in charge, you can do it. And it's
Right.
just a matter of doing everything you have to do to accomplish it. And, frankly, I threw a lot of things at the wall as a GC, and even prior to being a GC, to try to diversify and also to just make the department better. And some worked and some didn't, and fine. That's life. Don't be scared. Try a lot of stuff. Don't be scared about admitting something failed, and move on, come up with more things. But if you're clear enough about what you're trying to accomplish and you're determined to accomplish it, and you're willing to just experiment a lot and empower others to experiment, that, by the way, is the single biggest secret. The best thing I ever did was set up a diversity committee, put a really capable person in charge, Tamara, and say, here, I'll provide you the resources, you take it on. If you're just that determined, it'll happen.
Yes. That is perfect, and it's a perfect way to end them. Thank you so much, Mark, for being here to BS with me today. And thanks to everyone for listening. Until the next episode, remember that everybody is different, and different is good.
Hit it! That's what I'm talking about.
Wait! Okay, now, from the beginning.
We hope you enjoyed the stories shared in today's episode of BS, Beyond Stereotypes. Join us next time when another authentic personality unleashes their uniqueness on the world.